The cry wasn't loud anymore. That was the terrifying part. 4 hours into the transatlantic flight, David Parham's screams had dissolved into something worse, a fractured rhythmic wheeze that barely registered above the jet engine's hum. The sound was wrong. Fundamentally, biologically wrong. It was the noise of a 4-month-old infant whose body was beginning the process of shutting down. Kenneth Parham sat rigid in the cream leather seat, his 6'3" frame folded around the tiny bundle in his arms like a fortress that had already failed. His Patek Philippe watch, worth more than most people's homes, caught the recessed lighting as his hands trembled. Those same hands had signed death warrants with steady precision, had orchestrated the movement of contraband across 17 countries without a single wasted gesture, had built a logistics empire that served as the circulatory system for half the illegal trade flowing through the eastern seaboard. None of it mattered now. David's lips were cracked and pale, his miniature fists clenched against Kenneth's charcoal Tom Ford suit. The baby had refused every bottle for 36 hours. Refused formula, refused expressed milk from the freezer, refused water. His late mother's death 2 weeks ago had triggered something primal and devastating. A rejection of survival itself. The pediatrician's words played on loop in Kenneth's mind. If he doesn't take sustenance within 48 hours, we're looking at emergency intervention. Possibly permanent damage. Kenneth had faced down federal prosecutors, survived 3 assassination attempts, and walked away from a Colombian cartel negotiation that left 2 men dead at the table. He did not know helplessness. He did not know fear. Until now. His right-hand man, Marcus, stood near the cockpit door, phone pressed to his ear, his usual stone-faced composure cracked by something uncomfortably close to panic. Every contact had been exhausted. Every pediatric specialist who could be bought or threatened had offered the same useless advice. The baby needed his mother. The baby needed time. The baby needed things that no longer existed or that Kenneth couldn't provide. The jet's cabin was obscenely quiet otherwise. 8 leather seats, each worth more than a luxury sedan, stretched across the custom interior. Mahogany accents. Hand-stitched carpeting. A galley stocked with Cristal and Japanese A5 Wagyu. All of it suddenly felt like a mausoleum built for his son's last hours. David's breathing hitched. Kenneth's jaw clenched so hard his molars ached. That's when she moved. Betty Adams had been sitting 4 rows back, close enough to hear everything, far enough to maintain the invisible boundary between their worlds. She was the only other passenger. A last-minute addition Marcus had cleared after Kenneth commandeered the charter that was supposed to ferry her to a medical conference in Geneva. The airline had offered her an obscene upgrade fee that she couldn't refuse, bumping her to the private departure. She stood now, and Kenneth's eyes tracked her with the automatic assessment of a predator. Early 30s. Deep brown skin that caught gold undertones in the cabin lighting. Hair pulled back in a neat professional bun. Pink cotton shirt and dark jeans that screamed middle-class traveler, in a space designed for oligarchs. Everything about her posture radiated competence, but it was her eyes that made Kenneth's pulse spike, dark, steady, and fixed on David with an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself, the look of someone watching another human die. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Kenneth could smell something clean and faintly floral over the leather and recirculated air. "I'm a NICU nurse," she said, her voice low and remarkably calm. "Lactation consultant. That baby is dehydrated and starving, and you have maybe 12 hours before his organs start to fail." Kenneth's eyes narrowed. "I know." "Then you know your options." Betty's gaze held his without flinching, and Kenneth felt something shift in his chest. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Very few people looked at him directly. "I can help. But we need to do it now, and you need to understand what you're asking me to risk." The jet hit a pocket of turbulence. David's whimper cut through the cabin like a blade. Kenneth Parham, who had built an empire on never showing weakness, heard himself say the 2 words that would destroy everything. "Please. Help." Betty's hands were already moving before Kenneth finished speaking, that muscle memory from 6 years in the NICU overriding every rational objection screaming in her head. She closed the distance between them and held out her arms. Kenneth hesitated for only a heartbeat before surrendering his son, and the weight of the infant settling against her chest triggered something visceral. Grief, purpose, the phantom ache of empty arms she'd been carrying for 3 years. David was limp. Too limp. His fontanelle was visibly sunken. His skin had lost elasticity. Stage 2 dehydration. Possibly stage 3. Betty's fingers found his pulse point. Thready and rapid. 90 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes before she'd need to make the call between intervention and watching him slip away on a plane at 37,000 feet. When did he last urinate? Her voice was clinical, detached. The armor she'd perfected after Louisville. 8 hours. Maybe 9. Kenneth stood, and Betty registered his full height for the first time. The man radiated violence the way some people radiated warmth. Everything about him, the razor-sharp tailoring, the geometric precision of his haircut, the white gold signet ring that probably cost more than her annual salary, screamed control. Except his eyes. His eyes were drowning. The lavatory. Now. Betty was already moving toward the rear of the cabin, past the galley with its ridiculous marble countertops. Marcus started to follow, but Kenneth's hand shot out, stopping him with a single gesture. The lavatory was absurdly spacious, larger than her studio apartment's bathroom, all gleaming chrome and backlit mirrors. Betty locked the door, set David on the cushioned changing table, and began unbuttoning her shirt with shaking hands. This was insane. This violated a dozen professional protocols, opened her to liability she couldn't begin to calculate, crossed boundaries that existed for reasons she understood intimately. But the baby's breathing was growing shallower. Betty had maintained her milk supply after her daughter's death through sheer stubborn grief, pumping and donating to the hospital's milk bank because destroying that last biological connection felt like killing Zara a second time. 3 years of appointments with a therapist who gently suggested she was avoiding closure. 3 years of her body performing a function for a child who no longer existed. Until now. She lifted David with practiced efficiency, supporting his head, positioning him at the correct angle. His lips found her instinctively, that hardwired survival reflex kicking in despite his exhaustion. The first pull was weak. The second was stronger. By the third, David's entire body had engaged, small fists kneading against her skin with desperate intensity. Betty closed her eyes and felt tears she'd been holding for 36 hours finally break free. The baby fed. Her body responded. And somewhere in the rational part of her brain that still functioned, she understood with absolute clarity that she'd just crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. When she emerged 20 minutes later, David was asleep against her shoulder, his breathing steady and deep. Kenneth stood exactly where she'd left him, a sentinel in a $5,000 suit, and the expression on his face made Betty's stomach drop. It wasn't gratitude. It was ownership. "We need to talk," Kenneth said quietly, "about what happens when we land." Betty handed David back to Kenneth with the careful precision of a nurse completing a handoff, not a woman who'd just sustained another woman's child with her own body. The baby's color had returned, soft pink instead of that terrifying gray-tinged pallor. His breathing was even. Small mercies that felt monumental at 37,000 feet. "He'll need to feed again in 2 to 3 hours, Betty said, her voice steady despite the way her hands wanted to shake. "His stomach capacity is compromised right now. Small, frequent feeds until we can get him properly assessed." Kenneth nodded once, his attention fixed on his son with an intensity that would have been tender if not for the absolute stillness of his body. When he finally looked up at Betty, his expression had shifted into something colder, more calculated. The desperate father had receded, and in his place sat a man who'd clearly spent the last 20 minutes running equations she didn't want to understand. "Sit down, Ms. Adams." It wasn't a request. Betty remained standing for 3 full seconds, long enough to make her point, before sliding into the seat across from him. The leather was butter-soft and probably cost more than her car. She hated how much she noticed these things, hated the way poverty had trained her to inventory wealth like a threat assessment. You saved my son's life. Kenneth's voice was pleasant, almost conversational. I don't have adequate words for what that means to me. You're welcome. When we land, I'll need contact information for his pediatrician so I can. When we land, Kenneth interrupted gently, you'll be coming with us. The cabin pressure seemed to drop. Betty's pulse kicked into her throat. Excuse me. David's survival is now contingent on your availability. That makes you essential personnel. Kenneth shifted the baby slightly, and Betty caught the glint of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. Her stomach turned to ice. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 a week for the next month. Room and board provided at my estate. Round-the-clock security. A contract that protects your interests and ensures your cooperation. I have a job. A life. A conference in Geneva that will be attended by someone else. Kenneth's tone didn't change, but something in the air shifted. Darkened. Ms. Adams, I need you to understand something. The nature of my business creates certain vulnerabilities. My son is the most significant of those vulnerabilities. Anyone who becomes essential to his welfare becomes a target. That includes you. As of 20 minutes ago, when you made the choice to help him. Betty's mouth went dry. You're saying I'm in danger because I kept your child from dying? I'm saying you're in danger because certain people will now view you as leverage. Or as an obstacle. Kenneth leaned forward, and Betty saw it clearly now. The predator beneath the bespoke tailoring. I can protect you. I can compensate you extraordinarily well. Or I can put you on a commercial flight to Geneva with a security detail that will make your life a surveillance nightmare. Your choice, Ms. Adams. But you need to understand that neutrality is no longer an option. David stirred in his arms, making small suckling noises in his sleep. Betty thought about her studio apartment in Newark. Her 16-hour shifts. The medical school loans she'd been chipping away at for a decade. The therapist bills. The crushing, ordinary weight of a life built on survival rather than security. How much did you say? She heard herself ask. Kenneth smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. 50,000. Per week. 1 month minimum. Renegotiable if circumstances change. $200,000. Enough to disappear if she needed to. Enough to rebuild. Enough to make her complicit. I want the contract in writing before we land, Betty said quietly. With termination clauses. And I want the name of a lawyer who isn't on your payroll to review it. Done. Kenneth extended his hand. Welcome to the family, Ms. Adams. Betty shook it and felt the trap close around her wrist like a velvet manacle. The compound wasn't a mansion. It was a statement. Betty watched through the SUV's tinted windows as they passed through the third security checkpoint in as many minutes, each one progressively more sophisticated. Biometric scanners. Armed guards in tactical gear who moved with military precision. Cameras that tracked their vehicle with mechanical efficiency. The main house materialized through manicured hedges like something from an architecture magazine. All glass and steel and impossible angles, perched on what had to be 50 acres of Connecticut coastline. David had started crying again 20 minutes after they'd cleared customs at a private airfield Betty didn't know existed. Not the desperate screams from the plane, but a high-pitched painful wail that had Kenneth barking orders into his phone in Italian while Marcus drove like they were fleeing a crime scene. His temperature's elevated, Betty said, her fingers pressed against David's forehead. The baby was strapped into a car seat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and even through his designer onesie she could feel the heat radiating off his small body. He needs a pediatrician. Now. 5 minutes, Kenneth said tersely. Dr. Chen is already on site. The SUV stopped beneath a portico that belonged in Dubai, not Connecticut. Before Betty could unbuckle David, 2 men in dark suits had flanked the vehicle, and a small Asian woman in her 60s was striding toward them with a medical bag that looked serious enough for field surgery. The next 30 minutes blurred into controlled chaos. Dr. Chen, who, Betty learned, maintained a 24-hour on-call status exclusively for Kenneth's household, examined David in a nursery that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually met a baby but had unlimited access to luxury catalogs. Everything was white and chrome and aggressively modern. The crib probably cost $10,000. The monitoring equipment was hospital-grade. David's temperature was 101.3. Mild dehydration despite Betty's intervention. Possible infection, possibly just stress response to the drastic changes in his feeding routine. Dr. Chen prescribed antibiotics as a precaution, praised Betty's quick thinking on the plane, and departed with the kind of professional discretion that suggested she'd seen much worse in this house. Kenneth disappeared immediately after, leaving Betty alone with a sleeping David and instructions that someone named Teresa would show her to her quarters. Teresa turned out to be a severe woman in her 50s who spoke only when necessary and led Betty through a house that felt more like a museum than a home. 16 bedrooms. 9 bathrooms. A wine cellar that stretched beneath the entire east wing. A gym that could service a professional sports team. An office behind a reinforced door that Teresa didn't even glance at as they passed. Betty's quarters were a suite larger than her entire apartment. Bedroom, sitting room, and a bathroom with heated marble floors and a shower that had more settings than her car. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the Sound, and the view would have been breathtaking if Betty could ignore the discreet cameras positioned at each corner. "The nursery adjoins through that door," Teresa said, pointing to a connecting entrance Betty hadn't noticed. "Mr. Parham thought you'd want to be close. Kitchen privileges are 24 hours. The security staff changes shifts at 6 and 6. Don't approach the east perimeter. The dogs patrol there after dark." Dogs. Of course there were dogs. Teresa left her with a tablet containing house rules, emergency protocols, and a staff directory that included a private chef, 3 housekeepers, and something ominously labeled security coordinator. Betty scrolled through it with numb fingers, her mind struggling to process the transition from her cramped studio to this gilded prison in less than 12 hours. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Kenneth filled the doorway, somehow looking more dangerous in casual clothes. Dark jeans and a black Henley that did nothing to soften his presence. "David's resting comfortably," he said. "Dr. Chen will return in the morning. In the meantime, I thought you should understand exactly who you're working for." He stepped into the room and closed the door. "My name is Kenneth Parham. On paper, I own a logistics company that handles international freight. In reality, I control a network that moves 40% of the contraband flowing through the eastern seaboard. Weapons, currency, pharmaceuticals. I don't touch human trafficking or narcotics. I have standards, but make no mistake, Ms. Adams. Everything you see here is built on activities that would earn me consecutive life sentences." Betty's throat went dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to understand the stakes." Kenneth moved to the French doors, his silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. "My wife, David's mother, died 2 weeks ago. Car accident on the Merritt Parkway. Except it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted her dead, and by extension, wanted my son vulnerable." He turned, and Betty saw something raw beneath the calculated menace. "You're the only thing keeping my son alive right now. That makes you either the most valuable asset I have, or the most dangerous liability. I haven't decided which yet." The cage door slammed shut so loudly Betty could hear the echo in her bones. Betty didn't sleep that first night. She lay in sheets that probably cost more than her security deposit, listening to David's breathing through the baby monitor, and calculated exactly how thoroughly she destroyed her life. By 3 a.m., the calculations had transformed into cold, furious clarity. She found Kenneth in his office at dawn. He didn't seem surprised when she walked through the unlocked door without knocking, just looked up from whatever he'd been reading on his laptop with that predator's assessment she was starting to recognize. The office was all dark wood and leather, bookshelves lined with volumes that actually looked red. A single window overlooked the Sound, where early light was turning the water silver. I need to know exactly what I'm up against, Betty said without preamble. Not the sanitized version. Not the veiled threats. The actual specific danger that walking onto your plane has put me in. Kenneth leaned back in his chair, and something that might have been respect flickered across his face. Sit down, Ms. Adams. I'll stand. Suit yourself. He closed the laptop with deliberate precision. 3 weeks ago, my wife received a credible death threat from an organization we call the Syndicate. They're a rival operation, smaller than mine, but more violent. Less discriminating about their business practices. They've been trying to absorb my network for 2 years. And they killed her. They made it look like an accident. Brake line failure on a road she drove every day. The investigation is calling it manufacturer defect, which tells me they have someone inside the state police. Kenneth's jaw tightened. David's vulnerability is their opening. A 4-month-old heir with a grieving, distracted father makes for easy leverage. Betty's stomach turned. So when I helped him on the plane, you became visible. Marcus swept for surveillance at the airfield, but the Syndicate has resources. They'll know by now that my son has a wet nurse. They'll have your name, your background, probably your bank account numbers by tomorrow. Kenneth stood and moved to the window, hands in his pockets. They'll view you one of 2 ways. Either as a vulnerability they can exploit, kidnap you, hurt you, force me to negotiate. Or as an asset they can steal, take you and David both, eliminate me, and absorb my infrastructure while the heir is still young enough to mold. The words landed like body blows. Betty forced herself to breathe through the panic. You said a week on the plane. You said 1 month in the contract. I lied. Kenneth turned, and his expression was stone. I need you until David is weaned or until I've eliminated the threat. Whichever comes first. The timeline I gave you was to secure your cooperation before you understood the scope of the situation. Rage flooded through Betty's veins, hot and clarifying. You manipulated me. I saved your life by bringing you here instead of letting you walk into Geneva as an unprotected target. Kenneth's voice didn't rise, but the force behind it filled the room. Make no mistake, Ms. Adams. The moment you touched my son, you entered a war zone. I'm offering you the best chance of surviving it. Betty's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, hard. Then we renegotiate. Right now. Excuse me. You want me compliant? You want me invested in David's survival beyond basic human decency? Then I need insurance. Betty moved to his desk, grabbed a legal pad and pen, and started writing with sharp, angry strokes. I draft the contract this time. Real terms. Real exit clauses. Real protection. Kenneth watched her, something dangerous and almost amused playing at the corners of his mouth. What are you proposing? $75,000 a week, deposited into an account you can't access. Full legal immunity for anything I witness while under this roof. I want that in writing from a real attorney, not whoever you have on retainer. A security detail that answers to me, not you, once this is over. And a guaranteed extraction plan if your syndicate comes for me. That's ambitious. That's survival. Betty looked up, meeting his eyes with every ounce of steel she could summon. You said I'm either an asset or a liability. Let me be clear, Mr. Parham. If you want me to be an asset, you need to treat me like one. That means agency. That means protection. That means when this is over, I walk away with enough resources to disappear if I need to. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Then Kenneth smiled. A real smile this time, sharp and genuine. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. Is that a yes? It's a negotiation. He came around the desk, plucked the legal pad from her hands, and scanned her terms with the efficiency of someone who'd reviewed 1,000 contracts. 75 is acceptable. Immunity is doable but will take 3 days to arrange properly. Security detail answerable to you is non-negotiable. They answer to me or they're useless. But I'll compromise. Shared authority. You get veto power on personnel. Betty's pulse hammered. And the extraction plan? Kenneth set down the pad and looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been threat assessment. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. If the syndicate breaches this compound, Marcus has orders to get you and David out first. I've arranged a safe house in Nova Scotia under a name that doesn't trace to me. You'll have access to $2 million in cash and a new identity if you need it. He paused. But understand this, Ms. Adams. If you run alone. David stays with me. The implication was clear. Her safety or his son's. Never both. Betty picked up the pen and added one final clause at the bottom of the page. In the event of employer's death, employee assumes full custody and guardianship of the minor child with immediate access to all extraction resources. She slid it across the desk. Kenneth read it. His expression went very still. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name in sharp, decisive letters. You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Adams. So are you, Mr. Parham. Betty took the contract and folded it carefully. The difference is, I'm willing to lose. The routine established itself with surprising ease, like water finding its level. Betty woke at 6, fed David in the nursery's leather glider while sunrise painted the sound in shades of rose and gold, then handed him to Teresa for his morning bath while she ate breakfast in the sunlit kitchen. Dr. Chen visited every third day. Marcus maintained his silent, omnipresent surveillance. Kenneth appeared and disappeared according to rhythms Betty learned not to question. By the end of the first week, she'd stopped flinching at the armed guards. By the end of the second, she'd memorized which cameras had audio and which were visual only. Small adaptations to an abnormal life. But David was the crack in her armor. She'd promised herself clinical detachment. Professional distance. This was a job, not motherhood. A transaction with an expiration date. Except David didn't know that. He knew her smell, her heartbeat, the specific pitch of her voice when she sang him the lullabies she'd once sung to Zara. He knew the way her arms felt, the rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her body against his. He knew her as mother. And Betty, despite every wall she'd built, despite 3 years of therapy and determined emotional cauterization, felt herself fall in love with another woman's child. It happened in increments too small to defend against. The way David's fist would curl around her finger while he fed. The small satisfied sounds he made when she rocked him after midnight feedings. The way his eyes, dark like Kenneth's, but softer somehow, would track her across the room with absolute trust. By week 3, Betty caught herself planning his future. Wondering about preschools. Imagining birthday parties. Building fantasies around a child she had no claim to. Kenneth noticed. She found him watching her one evening while she played with David on the nursery floor, building towers from soft blocks that David would immediately demolish with delighted shrieks. When she looked up, something in Kenneth's expression made her breath catch, raw and unguarded, like she discovered him without his mask. He hasn't laughed like that since Amara died, Kenneth said quietly. Betty sat back on her heels, suddenly self-conscious. He's getting stronger. Dr. Chen says his weight's up to the 45th percentile. It's not about the weight. Kenneth moved into the room, lowered himself to the floor with surprising grace for a man his size. David immediately crawled toward him, babbling incomprehensible syllables. Kenneth scooped him up, and Betty saw the transformation that happened every time he held his son. The softening, the emergence of someone younger and less damaged beneath the criminal architect. You're good for him. For us. The us hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Betty didn't want to examine. The dinners started after that. Kenneth would appear at 7, after David was asleep, and suggest they eat together. Not in the formal dining room with its absurd crystal chandelier, but in the smaller breakfast nook that overlooked the gardens. He'd have the chef prepare things that felt almost normal. Pasta, roasted chicken, simple salads, and they'd talk. Not about the business. Not about the syndicate. Kenneth talked about Amara, how they'd met in law school, how she'd wanted legitimacy he couldn't give her, how David had been their last attempt at building something clean. Betty talked about nursing school, about Zara's sudden illness, about the mistake she'd made in Louisville that had cost a different child his life and her career its trajectory. Kenneth listened the way most people didn't, with full attention, without judgment, like he was cataloging every word for later analysis. "I'm liquidating the weapons division," he said one night, apropos of nothing. Betty looked up from her wine. "What?" "Moving the assets into legitimate holdings. Real estate. Tech investments. It'll take 18 months, but I'm starting the process." Kenneth's fingers drummed against the table, the only tell of his tension. David deserves better than inheriting a criminal empire. Betty struggled for words. "That's a massive shift." "It's necessary." His eyes found hers. "You made me realize that. Watching you with him. Seeing what actual goodness looks like instead of just the performance of it." Something warm and dangerous unfurled in Betty's chest. She recognized it with delayed horror. Not gratitude. Not professional satisfaction. Attraction. "Kenneth. I know." He smiled, and it was the saddest expression she'd seen on his face. "Terrible timing. Inappropriate power dynamics. You're here under duress. I understand all the reasons this is a catastrophically bad idea." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because if something happens to me, I need you to know that this—" He gestured vaguely at the house, at David sleeping upstairs, at the space between them. "Isn't just strategy anymore. It stopped being strategy the first time I watched you sing to my son at 3 a.m. and realized I'd never seen anyone fight so hard to stay emotionally detached while failing so beautifully." Betty's throat closed. "You're romanticizing a hostage situation." "Maybe." Kenneth stood, collecting their plates with domestic efficiency that felt surreal. "Or maybe I'm just telling you the truth before I run out of time to say it." He left her sitting alone in the breakfast nook, the sound of the ocean drifting through open windows, and Betty realized with creeping dread that she was falling too. Not just for David. For both of them. The next morning, she found Marcus in the kitchen at dawn, his expression grimmer than usual. "Mr. Parham's meeting with his accountants again," Marcus said without preamble. "Third time this week. The legitimate ones, not the ones who handle the offshore structures." Betty poured coffee with hands that wanted to shake. So people are noticing. "Carlo, one of the senior lieutenants, asked me yesterday if the boss was sick. Said Kenneth's been distracted. Making unusual moves. Talking about legacy and clean exits." Marcus's eyes found hers, and Betty saw the warning. In this business, distraction gets you killed. And people are starting to wonder what's distracting him. Betty thought about Kenneth's confession. About the way he looked at her across the dinner table. About the disaster she was walking toward with open eyes. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying be careful, Ms. Adams. For all our sakes." He picked up his coffee and headed for the door, then paused. "And I'm saying if you hurt that man or his son, you'll discover there are worse things in this world than the syndicate." The threat was delivered with perfect politeness. It landed like a knife between her ribs. Betty fed David that morning with trembling hands, wondering when exactly she'd crossed from prisoner to participant in her own destruction. Betty found the discrepancy at 2 a.m. while David slept, and insomnia had driven her to review his medical files on the tablet Dr. Chen had left for record-keeping. She almost missed it. Would have missed it if she hadn't been a NICU nurse trained to catch the kind of medication errors that killed infants in their sleep. David's vitamin D supplementation had been documented as 400 IU daily since birth. Standard dosage. Except 3 weeks before Amara's death, someone had changed it to 4,000 IU. 10 times the recommended amount. Not enough to cause immediate toxicity, but sustained over weeks? It would cause the exact symptoms David had exhibited: appetite suppression, irritability, dehydration, failure to thrive. Betty's hands went cold. She pulled up the earlier records, tracing back through the entries. The change had been logged under Dr. Chen's credentials, but the timestamp was wrong: 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when Dr. Chen had been documented at a medical conference in Boston. Betty had enough experience with electronic health records to know what she was looking at. Someone had accessed David's files remotely. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of both the system and pediatric medicine. Someone who'd wanted David sick enough to be vulnerable, but not sick enough to trigger immediate hospitalization. Someone inside Kenneth's operation. She found Kenneth in his office, still dressed despite the hour, staring at spreadsheets that looked like they involved more zeros than Betty's brain could process at 2:30 a.m. "We have a problem," she said. Kenneth looked up, read her expression, and immediately closed his laptop. "Show me." Betty walked him through it: the dosage change, the timestamp discrepancy, the calculated precision of symptoms that would make an infant dependent and a father desperate. Kenneth's face went progressively harder as she talked, until he looked like something carved from granite and malice. "How long have you known?" His voice was deadly quiet. 15 minutes. "I came straight here." "You're certain it wasn't Dr. Chen?" "Unless she's learned to bilocate, yes." Betty pulled up the conference documentation on her phone. She gave the keynote address in Boston the morning this change was logged. "There are photos." Kenneth stood and walked to the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he'd been carrying alone for too long. "I've suspected a mole for 6 weeks. Since before Amara died. Money moving incorrectly. Information leaking to the syndicate. Security protocols being compromised in ways that suggested inside knowledge." He turned, and Betty saw something raw beneath the control. "I suspected Amara." The words landed like a bomb in the quiet office. "Your wife. My wife who wanted out of this life. Who hated what I'd built. Who threatened to take David and disappear 3 months before she died." Kenneth's jaw worked. "I had her followed. Found encrypted communications I couldn't break. Meetings with people I couldn't identify. I was planning to confront her the week of the accident." Betty's mind raced. "You think she was working with the syndicate?" "I think she was doing something. And I think whoever killed her did it because she was either a threat or an asset they wanted to eliminate before I could leverage her." Kenneth moved back to the desk, braced his hands against it. "And now someone with access to my systems is actively sabotaging my son. Which means the threat isn't external anymore. It's in this house." The implication crystallized with horrifying clarity. Betty thought about Teresa's careful efficiency. Dr. Chen's convenient availability. Marcus's constant presence. The security staff who rotated through with military precision. How many people have access to David's medical records? 7. Dr. Chen, her nurse practitioner, Teresa who manages household records, Marcus, my head of security, and 2 of my senior accountants who handle health insurance documentation. "And me." Kenneth's eyes found hers, sharp and assessing. "And you. But you're the only one who brought this to me instead of using it as leverage. Which makes you either the most trustworthy person in this compound or the smartest operative I've ever encountered." "I'm not." Betty started then stopped. Because what could she say? That she wasn't playing games? She'd negotiated her own contract with the ruthlessness of someone who understood exactly how dangerous this world was. That she wasn't involved? She'd let herself fall in love with his son, had let herself imagine futures that involved staying. Kenneth crossed the space between them in 3 strides. Suddenly he was too close, close enough that Betty could smell his cologne, something expensive and cedar-sharp. Close enough to see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "I need to know I can trust you," he said quietly. "Not the contract. Not the money. You. Betty. Can I trust you with my son's life?" Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't about David anymore. This was Kenneth asking if she was with him, truly with him, in whatever war was coming. Yes, she heard herself say. You can trust me. Then I need you to help me find who's doing this. Because if someone inside has access to David's records, they have access to everything. Security protocols. Safe house locations. Every vulnerability we have. Kenneth, I'm a nurse. I don't know how to. You know how to see patterns. How to catch mistakes that kill. His hand came up, hovered near her face without quite touching. You caught this when no one else did. When I didn't. That makes you more valuable to me right now than anyone on my payroll. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Betty knew she should step back. Should maintain the professional distance she'd been clinging to like a life raft. Instead she found herself swaying forward, just slightly. What do you need me to do? Kenneth's expression shifted, something dark and hungry replacing the calculation. I need you to stay close to David. Document everything. Everyone who interacts with him. Every anomaly, no matter how small. His voice dropped. And I need you to stay safe. Because if they're targeting him, they'll come for you next. His hand finally made contact, fingers brushing her jaw with unexpected gentleness. Betty's breath caught. Kenneth, I know this is complicated. I know every reason this is wrong. His thumb traced her cheekbone. But if someone's going to kill me, Betty, I need to know my son will have you. Not just as a nurse. As his mother. The real one. The one who chose him. Betty's eyes burned. You can't ask me that. I already did. The moment I brought you into this house. Kenneth leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you haven't imagined keeping him. Building something with us. Tell me it's just the job. She couldn't. God help her, she couldn't. This is insane, she whispered. Everything about this is insane. Kenneth's lips were an inch from hers. But it's also the first real thing I've felt since Amara died. Maybe before. Betty closed the distance. The kiss was desperate, furious, 3 weeks of tension detonating between them. Kenneth's hand fisted in her hair, pulling her closer, and Betty kissed him back with a kind of reckless need she hadn't felt in years. This was stupid. Dangerous. Exactly the kind of attachment that would get her killed. She didn't care. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kenneth rested his forehead against hers. We're going to figure this out, he said. Together. And then I'm going to give you the choice I never gave Amara. Stay or go. Freely. No contracts. Betty laughed, the sound shaky. You're offering me an exit while someone's actively trying to kill your son? I'm offering you the truth. Whatever else I am, I won't trap you the way I trapped her. Betty pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Saw the sincerity there, the vulnerability he was offering like a weapon she could use against him. Ask me again when we're not in the middle of a war, she said. Kenneth smiled. Genuine. Devastating. Deal. The tablet on his desk chimed. Marcus's name flashed across the screen with a message that made Kenneth's expression go hard. Perimeter breach. East Sector. Multiple hostiles. Get David, Kenneth said, his voice shifting into command mode. Safe room. Now. Betty was already running. The alarm system died before Betty reached the nursery. 1 second the compound was screaming with klaxons and flashing emergency lights. The next it went silent and dark with a kind of absolute totality that only came from deliberate system failure. Betty's heart slammed into her throat as she fumbled for the nursery door in sudden blackness. Her hands finding the handle just as backup generators kicked in with dim red emergency lighting. David was awake and crying in his crib, that high-pitched wail of infant terror that cut straight through her chest. Betty scooped him up, wrapped him in the blanket she'd been keeping warm for his next feeding, and ran for the safe room Kenneth had shown her during her second day. A reinforced panic room disguised as a linen closet at the end of the hallway. She made it 10 feet before the window exploded. Glass sprayed across the carpet in a glittering cascade. Betty threw herself sideways, covering David's body with her own as something metallic clattered across the floor. Smoke grenade. The realization came half a second before white chemical fog began billowing through the hallway, burning her eyes and throat. Through the chaos, she heard Marcus shouting orders somewhere below. Gunfire, sharp, controlled bursts that sounded nothing like the movies. More glass breaking. The heavy thud of doors being breached. Betty ran blind through the smoke, one hand covering David's face, the other trailing along the wall to maintain orientation. The safe room was close. 20 feet. 15. Her lungs were screaming. David's cries had gone silent in a way that terrified her more than the attack. She found the linen closet, yanked open the door and froze. Teresa stood inside the safe room, her normally severe face almost apologetic. She held a pistol pointed directly at Betty's chest. "I'm sorry, Ms. Adams," Teresa said. "But you need to come with me." The betrayal hit harder than the smoke. "You put the baby down. Slowly. Or I shoot you and take him anyway." Betty's mind raced through impossible calculations. David was limp against her chest, barely breathing. The hallway behind her was filling with armed men in tactical gear who definitely weren't Kenneth's security. Teresa's gun hand was steady, professional. "No good options. Kenneth will kill you for this," Betty said, buying seconds she didn't have. "Kenneth is about to have much bigger problems." Teresa gestured with the gun. "The baby. Now." Movement behind Teresa, a shadow resolving into Marcus, blood streaming from a gash across his temple. He moved with brutal efficiency, one arm wrapping around Teresa's throat, the other slamming her gun hand against the doorframe. The pistol clattered free. "Run!" Marcus roared at Betty. "East stairwell, go!" Betty ran. Behind her, she heard the meaty impact of bodies colliding, Teresa's choked curse, Marcus's grunt of pain. She didn't look back. David was struggling weakly against her chest, trying to cry but unable to draw enough breath through the smoke. Betty's own lungs felt like they were filled with acid. The east stairwell was a secondary escape route, Kenneth had said. Led to the garage and an armored SUV with keys always in the ignition. 50 yards. She could make 50 yards. She made 30. The man who stepped out of a side room was massive, 6'5" and built like a professional linebacker, wearing the same black tactical gear as the others. He didn't point a weapon. Didn't need to. He just placed himself between Betty and the stairwell with the calm confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Easy now," he said, his voice almost kind. "Nobody needs to get hurt. Just hand over the baby and wheel." Betty kicked him in the knee as hard as she could, then threw her shoulder into his center mass while he was off balance. He went down with a surprised grunt, and Betty vaulted over him. David clutched tight, adrenaline drowning out the burn in her muscles. The stairwell door was right there. 5 feet. 3. She heard Marcus scream her name from somewhere behind her, the word cut off mid-syllable by a sound that could only be gunfire. Betty's hand closed on the door handle. Someone grabbed her from behind, fingers like iron bands around her bicep. She spun, tried to wrench free, and saw the needle too late, a syringe industrial-sized, stabbing into her shoulder through her shirt. "No!" She tried to pull away, but the world was already tilting sideways. David was crying again, the sound fading like someone was dragging her underwater. Strong hands caught her as her knees gave out. Someone else was carefully extracting David from her arms, his cries growing more distant. "Subject secured," a voice said from very far away. "Package acquired. Extract now." Betty tried to fight, but her body wouldn't respond. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was Marcus's body crumpled at the top of the stairs, blood pooling beneath him in the red emergency lighting, his eyes open and unseeing. Then nothing. She woke to white walls and the antiseptic smell of medical facilities. Her head felt stuffed with cotton. Her mouth tasted like chemicals. David's cries echoed from somewhere close but out of sight. Hungry, frightened, calling for her. Betty tried to sit up and discovered her wrist was handcuffed to a hospital bed rail. The door opened. A woman walked in, mid-30s, strikingly beautiful, with David's dark eyes and Kenneth's sharp cheekbones. She wore designer clothes and an expression of cold assessment. She was also supposed to be dead. "Hello, Betty," Amara Parham said, holding her son. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." David wouldn't stop crying. The sound carved through Betty's drug-hazed confusion like a blade. Sharp, desperate, the particular pitch that meant he was hungry and didn't understand why his world had been turned inside out. Again. Amara tried rocking him, that automatic maternal sway that should have been soothing. David arched his back and screamed harder. "He doesn't know you," Betty said, her voice raw. The handcuff bit into her wrist as she tried to reach for him. "He's terrified. He will remember me." Amara's expression was steel-wrapped in silk. "I'm his mother. You were his mother." Past tense. Betty pulled against the restraint hard enough to bruise. "You died. You left him. And now you're what? Kidnapping him back." "I'm reclaiming what's mine." Amara handed David to someone outside Betty's line of sight. A nurse, maybe, or another operative, and the baby's cries intensified into genuine hysteria. The sound made Betty's milk let down involuntarily, her body responding to infant distress she couldn't address. Amara noticed, and something dark flickered across her face. "That must be uncomfortable. Let me feed him. Please. He hasn't eaten in hours, he'll dehydrate." "He'll eat when I decide." Amara pulled up a chair, crossed her legs with elegant precision. Everything about her screamed money and education, and a kind of refined cruelty that made Kenneth's violence look almost honest by comparison. "First, we're going to have a conversation about exactly what you are to my husband." Betty's laugh came out bitter. "I'm the woman who kept your son alive while you were busy faking your death." "That's what I am." "You're the woman who fucked my husband and played house with my child." Amara's voice remained pleasant, conversational. "Don't insult me by pretending it was purely professional." The accusation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Betty thought about Kenneth's hands in her hair, that desperate kiss in his office mere hours before this nightmare began. "I don't owe you explanations. You're dead, remember? Car accident. Tragic loss. Necessary exit strategy." Amara stood, moved to the small window that showed only darkness and the suggestion of trees. "Kenneth was never going to let me leave. I filed for divorce twice. He burned the papers. Threatened my lawyer. Made it very clear that the only way I was leaving was in a casket." She turned, and her smile was sharp enough to cut. "So I obliged him. By staging your death and abandoning your infant son. By surviving." Amara's composure cracked for just a moment, something raw bleeding through. "You don't know what it's like. Being married to a man who sees you as property. Who controls every aspect of your life. Who builds an empire on blood and then expects you to smile at charity galas and pretend you don't know where the money comes from." Betty thought about the compound, the security, the gilded cage she'd been living in for 3 weeks. "So you joined the competition? Started working with the syndicate to bring him down." "I became the competition." Amara's pride was evident now, a fierce satisfaction. "I didn't join the syndicate. I built it. From nothing." While Kenneth thought I was just a bored housewife attending book clubs and yoga classes, I was recruiting his enemies, stealing his infrastructure, positioning myself to take everything he loves. The scope of it was staggering. Betty's mind struggled to process the level of long-term planning, the cold calculation required. "Including David. Especially David." Amara's expression softened marginally. "He's my son. I carried him, birthed him. The fact that I had to leave him temporarily doesn't negate that bond." "Temporarily? He's 4 months old. You left when he was 2 months. That's half his life. A strategic sacrifice for long-term gain. Amara returned to her chair, that polished composure sliding back into place. And now I have him back. Along with Kenneth's complete surrender. Betty's stomach dropped. What? He's on his way here. Should arrive within the hour. Amara checked her watch, a Cartier that probably cost more than Betty's student loans. I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. His empire for his son's life. And yours, actually. I was feeling generous. The door opened before Betty could respond. Kenneth walked in flanked by 2 armed guards, and Betty's heart cracked at the sight of him. His suit was torn, blood spattered across the white shirt beneath. A bruise was blooming across his left cheekbone. But it was his eyes that destroyed her. Empty, devastated, the look of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. Those eyes found Betty first, scanned her for injuries with desperate efficiency, then moved to David, who was still crying in the arms of Amara's nurse. Let them go, Kenneth said quietly. That was the deal. Amara stood, and the dynamic in the room shifted. These were 2 apex predators circling each other, years of marriage and betrayal crackling between them like electricity. The deal was your empire for their lives. I'm prepared to honor that. Amara moved to the nurse, took David back. The baby's cries stuttered, confused by the unfamiliar scent. Sign over the accounts. The properties. The entire network. And I'll release Betty Adams with enough money to disappear. You get to walk away with your life, broken and alone. And David. David stays with me. His real mother. Amara's smile was poisonous. You can try for visitation in about 18 years when he's old enough to decide if he wants to know the man who destroyed his mother's life. Kenneth's jaw worked. Betty watched him do the math, weigh the impossible options. She knew what he'd choose before he said it. Done. Give me the papers. Kenneth, no. Betty yanked against the handcuff hard enough that she felt something tear. You can't. I can and I will. Kenneth didn't look at her, his entire focus on Amara. Let Betty go first. Then I sign. Amara considered this, then nodded to one of her guards. The man moved to Betty's bedside, produced a key. The handcuff clicked open. Betty rubbed her wrist, mind racing for options that didn't exist. She looked at Kenneth, this man who'd threatened her, manipulated her, and somehow made her fall in love with both him and his son in 3 impossible weeks. This man who was about to sacrifice everything. And she realized with sudden crystalline clarity that she wasn't going to let him. Actually, Betty said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart, I have a counteroffer. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. Amara's narrowed dangerously. You don't have leverage, Ms. Adams. Betty smiled. It felt sharp and foreign on her face. Actually, I do. Because there's something neither of you know about the liquidation Kenneth started 3 weeks ago. Kenneth's expression went very still. Betty held his gaze, willing him to trust her one more time. I helped him draft the legal framework. The real framework, not the version his accountants saw. The lie came easily, necessity making her a better actress than she'd ever been. And I embedded a failsafe that requires my biometric verification to complete any ownership transfer. Silence. Then Amara laughed, sharp and disbelieving. You're bluffing. Try me. Have him sign. See what happens when you try to access the accounts without my fingerprint authorization. Betty stood on shaking legs, walked toward Amara with more confidence than she felt. Kenneth was paranoid about internal threats. With good reason, apparently. So we designed a system where no single person, including him, could dismantle everything without multiple authentications. It was complete fiction. But it was plausible fiction, the kind of security measure a man like Kenneth would actually implement. Betty watched Amara's face, saw doubt flicker behind the certainty. She's lying, Amara said, but her voice had lost its edge. Kenneth's expression was unreadable. Is she? The question hung in the air, weighted with implications Betty didn't have time to unpack. She just gambled everything on a bluff that would either save them or get them all killed. Amara's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face went pale. What? One of the guards asked. Federal raid. The main warehouse. Amara's composure was cracking. Someone tipped them off. They're seizing everything. Betty felt Kenneth's eyes on her. She kept her expression neutral, but her mind was screaming. The lawyer. The one from her contract. The one who wasn't on Kenneth's payroll. She'd given him one instruction 3 days ago, to be executed if she ever missed a scheduled check-in. She'd missed tonight's check-in. The dominoes were falling exactly as she'd hoped. The room descended into controlled chaos. Amara's phone was lighting up with alerts. More raids, coordinated strikes across 3 states, her carefully constructed shadow empire collapsing in real time. Her guards were shifting nervously, hands drifting toward weapons, waiting for orders that Amara seemed temporarily incapable of giving. Kenneth moved first. He crossed the space to Betty in 3 strides, positioned himself between her and Amara's guards with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime anticipating violence. His hand found Betty's, squeezed once. A silent question and acknowledgement rolled into one gesture. What did you do? Amara's voice was very quiet, very dangerous. I protected myself, Betty said, surprised by how steady she sounded. You really think I'd spend 3 weeks in Kenneth's compound without building my own exit strategy? I'm not as naive as you thought. It wasn't entirely a lie. The lawyer had been real. The instructions had been real. She just never imagined she'd actually need to execute them, or that the timing would be this catastrophically perfect. Amara's expression shifted through several emotions: disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of bitter respect. The federal raid. You arranged that. I arranged for information to be released if I failed to check in. Details about warehouse locations, shipping manifests, financial records. Betty met Amara's eyes without flinching. What I didn't know was whose empire I'd be exposing. Kenneth's or yours? The implication landed. Amara's face went white. The warehouses being raided right now, Kenneth said slowly, realization dawning. Those are your facilities. Not mine. I started liquidating mine 3 weeks ago, Betty continued, the pieces falling into place as she spoke. The legitimate transition Kenneth initiated. Which means the only active criminal infrastructure still operating under the Parham name was mine. Amara's voice was hollow. You destroyed the syndicate. I destroyed whoever was threatening David. Betty's hand tightened in Kenneth's. I didn't particularly care which of you it was. David chose that moment to let out another desperate wail, the sound cutting through the tension like a serrated blade. Amara looked down at her son, then at the phone still buzzing with disaster alerts, then at Kenneth and Betty standing united against her. Betty saw the moment Amara made her choice. You can't leave, one of the guards said as Amara moved toward the door. We need to regroup, figure out. There's nothing to figure out. Amara's composure was fracturing, the polished exterior cracking to reveal something raw underneath. It's over. She destroyed 2 years of work in one phone call. She looked at Betty with something that might have been admiration or might have been pure hatred. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. I'm a survivor, Betty said. Just like you. Difference is, I wasn't trying to win. I was just trying to keep a baby alive. Amara handed David to the nurse, and Betty saw the way her hands trembled, the way she couldn't quite let go. For just a moment, she looked like what she was. A mother who'd made impossible choices and lost everything anyway. Take care of him, Amara said quietly. Then to Kenneth. I loved you. Once. Before you made me into this. Amara, Kenneth started, but she was already moving, already disappearing through the door with her remaining guards scrambling to follow. The nurse holding David stood frozen, uncertain. Betty walked over and gently took the baby, who immediately began rooting toward her, his cries quieting to desperate whimpers. Her body responded instantly, that biological imperative overriding the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "We need to leave," Kenneth said. "Now, before the feds expand their investigation." "Your Nova Scotia safe house." Betty adjusted David in her arms. "The one you told me about. Is it really clean? Completely off-grid. Cash purchased under a shell corporation that doesn't trace to either operation." Kenneth was already moving, checking the hallway, his tactical mind overriding everything else. 3 hours drive. We can be across the border by dawn." Betty followed him through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and fear, David nursing quietly against her chest, and tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd gambled everything on a bluff and a backup plan she'd barely thought through. She'd destroyed a criminal empire, possibly two, and somehow ended up exactly where she'd started 3 weeks ago. Running toward an uncertain future with a man she barely knew and a child she loved more than her own life. They emerged into a parking garage where Marcus was waiting beside an SUV, very much alive despite the blood and the collapse Betty had witnessed. He had fresh bandages across his temple and murder in his eyes. "Teresa?" Kenneth asked. "Contained. She'll live to answer questions." Marcus opened the rear door. "Safe house. Nova Scotia. You're not coming." Marcus's expression didn't change. "Sir. You're staying to handle the cleanup. Feed the feds enough to satisfy their warrants but nothing that traces to the legitimate assets. Then disappear." Kenneth clasped Marcus's shoulder. "This is the exit, old friend. For all of us." Marcus looked at Betty, then at David, then back to Kenneth. Something passed between them, years of loyalty, unspoken understanding, the acknowledgement of an ending. "She better be worth it," Marcus said. Kenneth smiled, and it was the first genuine expression Betty had seen on his face since the attack. "She already proved she is." They drove through the night with David sleeping between them in a car seat Marcus had somehow procured. Kenneth's hand found Betty's in the darkness, and she laced their fingers together, feeling the calluses and the strength and the slight tremor that betrayed his exhaustion. "You destroyed everything I built," Kenneth said after an hour of silence. "I saved your son. You saved all of us." He brought her hand to his lips. "The liquidation was going to take 18 months. You did it in one night." Betty laughed, the sound shaky with delayed shock. "I had no idea if it would work. The lawyer was supposed to release information about your operation. I didn't know Amara had built something separate." "Luck then. Or fate." Kenneth's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror. "Either way, we're free. Actually free. No empire. No leverage. Just us and whatever we can build from nothing." "That's terrifying," Betty whispered. "That's the point." Kenneth squeezed her hand. "You asked me once what I needed from you. I need this. Someone who'll burn down my world if it means saving my son. Someone who's stronger than me in all the ways that matter." Betty looked down at David, peaceful in sleep, his small hand curled around her finger. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago, alone, haunted, building walls against a world that kept taking everything she loved. And she thought about the woman she was becoming. Fierce, protective, willing to gamble everything on a future she couldn't control. "I'm keeping him," she said. "David. I know I don't have legal rights. I know Amara could come back. I know it's complicated. But I'm keeping him." "I know." Kenneth's voice was soft. "That's why I'm keeping you." They crossed the border at dawn, 3 people in an SUV with falsified papers and $2 million in cryptocurrency, leaving behind the ashes of 2 criminal empires and the ghosts of who they used to be. Betty fed David as sunrise painted the Canadian wilderness in shades of gold, and felt something in her chest a knot for the first time in 3 years. This wasn't the future she'd planned. It wasn't safe or certain or anything close to normal. But it was hers. Theirs. And for now that was enough. 6 months later, Betty stood on the porch of their small coastal house, watching Kenneth teach David to chase seagulls across the sand. The baby couldn't walk yet, but Kenneth held his hands, letting him take wobbling steps while David shrieked with laughter at birds that stayed just out of reach. This was what freedom looked like. Not wealth or power or control. Just a man, a woman, and a child they'd both chosen to fight for. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust your instincts when the world tells you to run. Betty had walked onto that plane expecting nothing more than a conference and a career boost. She'd walked off it as a mother, a protector, and someone who discovered that family isn't always about blood. It's about who you'd burn the world down for. To everyone navigating impossible choices, raising children alone, or wondering if you're strong enough to face what's coming, you already are. Strength isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up anyway. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more. Like, share, and tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment? Where are you watching from? Your support means everything. Until next time, trust yourself. You're stronger than you know.